Thank you all for coming, braving the elements and the ghosts and the goblins that are probably going to come out later today. My name is Jeff Nabisky. I'm the moderator for this morning's panel of RE the City, where the thrust of this section is reinventing the city. This session is sponsored by the Humanity Center, and it's also, the participants are all members of the Spaces and Places Working Group, which has its origins in a Humanity Center program from years ago, and we're still kind of ongoing concern, and we're grateful to the Humanity Center for helping to bring us along. I'm going to ask them to introduce Dean Haase for some opening remarks before we get into the substance of today.
Yes, I will speak before you get something substantial. Walter said that they needed a dignitary to open the ceremonies this morning. The dean was out of town, and the other associate deans were busy, so I got the job. I'm not sure I'm a dignitary. Yeah, sure. Good morning. Does that work?
A little bit.
Is it on?
Beyond mine.
Is that any better? Hello? Well, I'll just speak more loud.
That's better.
Okay, good. Well, on behalf of Dean Raskin and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, I'm happy to be here, and I'd like to welcome you to this symposium sponsored by the Humanities Center on the city. Do any of you remember the television show, or have you heard of the television series, police drama, Naked City? The Naked City? Do you remember how that ended? Every episode? There are 8 million stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them. Well, there are many stories in Detroit. Detroit has over 300 years worth of stories that have been told and retold, written and rewritten, filmed and filmed again, photographed and photographed again. In fact, narratizing Detroit is currently a local, national, and international obsession in the media and everywhere, in conversations, in restaurants, at homes, in classrooms. Detroit and the story of Detroit, or stories of Detroit, are being re-narrated again and again. Wayne State University and the University Cultural Center, which is where we are located, are not only part of Detroit's story, they also are a source and resource for many personal and academic narratives about the city and about this city. Resources like the Detroit Public Library's Urban Historical Collection or the Walter Reuther Archives on campus are gold mines for historians, sociologists, political scientists, sociologists, and the research that they carry out, that you carry out. And Wayne State, for a long time, has considered itself part of the story of Detroit and has considered itself to have an urban mission. And the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, which I represent, plays a critical role in that urban mission. The faculty in the social sciences and in the humanities in particular, although it's evident in every college, in every department across the university. But here in liberal arts, the social sciences, and the humanities conduct research and teaching that contribute in important ways to our understanding of Detroit's past, present, and they contribute to its future, whatever shape that might take or be taking as we speak. Wayne State and its Humanities Center are the right place for a symposium like this, and there can be no doubt in in my mind at any rate, that at this time of renewal, transformation, reimagining, and literally revisiting the city, this is the right time as well for a symposium like this. So there are many stories in and about the city, and each of you has one to tell today. And so I wish you a productive symposium today and a happy holiday. Thank you.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Newman, who's the first of our presenters today, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dean Costa. Thank you also to the Community Center and Walter for making this all possible. When we think about reinventing, reimagining, and rebuilding cities, nature, ecology, and sustainability are becoming central concerns right alongside and via traditional foci related to housing, education, and development in cities. There's a number of reasons for this, not least of which is the fact that the majority of the Earth's population has recently become urban, and so the stress of that on the environmental, the global ecosystem is coming to the center of attention in that regard. But at the same time, and this is something I want to talk about in great length today, there's really nothing new about invoking ideas about nature as a way to reinvent cities, particularly at an imaginary level as a kind of body politic. And indeed, the very fact that we often take nature for granted in the city, I think makes it a necessity to theorize its politics, or at least makes that necessity for theorization more urgent. If you look at Detroit Future City, one of the most striking things about it as a document is the amount of space given over to what is essentially urban nature and so-called green infrastructure. That's true of the document, but also of the vision of the city itself. And in fact, I'd argue that an aesthetic of kind of green futurism, more than any element in the DFC, is what gives it a kind of cutting-edge aesthetic or look and feel, while arguably distracting our attention from the unequal distribution of services that is at the core of the framework, and that I know that some of my colleagues are going to talk more about today. Given these concerns, it's sometimes tempting to view green space and urban nature as mere window dressing, or kind of urban greenwash on urban plannings. And to do that, though, I think is to make the assumption that nature is itself apolitical and ahistorical. It's just aesthetic. And what I want to do for the rest of this talk is basically argue quite the opposite, and argue that understandings of nature are actually central to understandings of the way cities are transformed. And I'm going to do that in a kind of classically anthropological fashion. I'm not going to talk about Detroit now anymore. I'm going to talk about another city comparatively, and that's Paris, France. The comparison will be entirely implicit, of course. But drawing from the politics of green space in Paris, where I've done the majority of my research, what I'm going to do is basically synthesize field work I've done since 2007 and make a couple broad theoretical points based on that. And I'm happy to talk more specifics about the ethnography afterwards. But first, let me say a few words about infrastructure and urban ethnography. Cultural and anthropological interest in infrastructure in many ways has its roots in SPS, and in many respects, Bruno Latour's general conceptual emphasis that privileges lines and assemblages over flat spaces. That's just a basic concept. And in other words, the city is increasingly being examined as a series of integrated networks and systems by ethnographers, in contrast to, let's say, a kind of classic Chicago school approach, which divides the cities into sets of zones and communities that are delimited in various ways. And urban political ecologists, in particular, have built on this approach by viewing infrastructure as a core of a concept called urban metabolism, which views the city itself as a series of flows produced by a variety of inputs ranging from power and water to naturally derived construction materials like gypsum or wood. And also, of course, paying attention to outputs from cities, in particular waste and the impact that has on the environment. Parks, interestingly enough, have been largely ignored in this scenario. And this is ironic because infrastructure is often theorized by urban political ecologists like Eric Swengedal as mediating the transformation of nature in the city. But in many ways, park systems do the opposite. They help mediate the symbolic transformation of the city into nature. This nature is not simply a blank slate, and as I'm going to show in Paris, parks have been important as a part of a kind of urban circulatory system channeling flows of power for a long time, and these flows of power have been historically important in constituting notions of nation, as well as the materiality of the state itself. Parks are also different in some ways than of power systems and plumbing systems, and that they're sites of encounter themselves, or spaces of encounter between diverse and often conflicted groups of residents on one hand, and they're sites of encounter between residents and agencies representing the state. And in this regard, parks are an important place where the right to the city is claimed, contested, and reworked, both by residents, but also by elites. And as an aside, by right to the city, what I'm really drawing on there is David Harvey's reading of Henri Lefebvre's concept. Right to the city sometimes talked about as the right to access something like housing, or maybe the right to walk down the sidewalk without being bothered by the police. But actually, I'm drawing on it in a broader way, and the way that Harvey draws on it is as the right of residents to define the use of the city, and in particular the use value of urban space as opposed to exchange value of urban space. So, to turn to Paris, throughout its history, parks and gardens have played an integral role in the city's identity as a capital going back to the pre-revolutionary period. Right at the center of the city of Paris is the Jardin des Tuileries, which is a royal garden, which kind of, in many ways, naturalizes divine right power in the heart of the city. It's actually the center of the city, is this garden. And the fascinating thing about the Tuileries is that it's designed as a part of a movement in classical French garden design to really demonstrate the power, the miracle of divine right power in shaping nature, both through fountains, but also through the famously carefully cut hedges and so on. Interestingly enough, after the revolution, the gardens weren't destroyed. They were in many ways redefined. And the Tuileries was actually renamed the Jardin National for a short time after the revolution. And this is a famous engraving showing the apotheosis of the goddess Reason. And at the same time, the constitution of a public. And of course, after the emergence of a republic, after a revolution, you get the idea of a public. And thus, the royal garden becomes the public garden. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, public gardens continued the tradition of showcasing man's mastery over nature, and the way that nature was defined was closely tied to the French colonial imperial projects in Africa, North Africa, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. This manifests itself in the design of the Paris park system as well. The infamous Jardin d'Acclimatation Anthropologique in Paris's Bois de Boulogne, which is actually the site of this site right here is the site of a brand new Frank Gehry building that's been getting a lot of press lately. This was a site in the Belle Époque era of Paris of what was essentially a human zoo that showcased colonial subjects and living tableaus for a visiting bourgeois public from the west side of Paris. Now here it might be important to emphasize that from the era of Haussmann going forward, the public garden was as socially important as a metaphor as it was as an actual architectural design. To this day, public gardens in Paris are conceived not where the concept of the public garden isn't the same often as an American park, where it's conceived as a kind of space of recreation and letting loose. They're actually spaces where behavior and movement is carefully controlled, both architecturally through limited access lawns. In fact, only recently in Paris were people allowed to use all the lawns in parks, and that was kind of a political move by the most recent mayor. But also management in the forms of policing in parks. And Paris parks have their own gardiens, as they're called. They carry whistles, and they'll blow whistles at you if you try to stay after the park closed, or if you're bouncing a ball around next to a nice flower bed or something like that. So there are spaces for often described. They've been described in my interviews as spaces for watching as opposed to living in, at least in the classical idea. Now, more than a century later, the civilizing mission of parks and their linkage to the empire is not entirely gone, but is metamorphosed into a new struggle over the public, in which the rhetoric of civilization has been replaced by that of civility, and as well as its counterpoint, delinquence, and now increasingly enough, sustainability. In Paris's northern edge, in a predominantly North African or Maghrebi and West African neighborhood, a movement emerged in the late 1990s to demand more green space for a neighborhood which had an overabundance of environmental ills in the forms of air pollution, soil pollution, toxic dumping, but also an underabundance of environmental goods, and notably the kinds of public gardens and green spaces that were common in the rest of the capital. Initially, Paris's political leaders resisted these demands on the ground that this particular public, whose Frenchness was very much in question, would simply misuse or even abuse these types of green spaces. One of the neighborhood's only public squares, known as the Square Léon, here are a couple of pictures of it, was, despite the fact that it's frequented a great deal, viewed by one neighborhood association member who I interviewed as a jardin de délinquance, or a delinquency garden, because residents would not abide by the rules laid down by the Parks Department. So in interviews with the Guardians, for example, the teenagers would not obey the Parks Department guards when it came time for them to go home at night, so there's this kind of conduct issue. But also, there was an issue with small-time drug dealers selling hashish or hash in the park. And the gardeners found themselves unable to trim the hedges because the drug dealers were basically using the hedges to hide their stashes in. And this caused a real panic over the Parks Department's management of the space. And the subversion, this kind of subversion of the natural and social order of the park, led the Parks Department to essentially abandon the space and let the users kind of self-regulate. And which is itself, if you follow French politics and French political discourse, is a kind of fantasy of a dystopian republic breakdown with when you have this kind of image of a largely immigrant population taking over the role of the state in regulating public civility. So in many ways, the Parks Department enacted or played out this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of French immigration politics. And for a long time, the solution to this disruptive public in the 18th and 19th arrondissements in the eyes of the disruptive public in the eyes of the Parks Department. One thing I should say about the spaces in the northern part of Paris is if you look at classic urban sociology on the use of public spaces like William H. White, let's say, or recent work by Seth Lowe, all of the kind of checklist that you often see for a successful public space, which involves crowds of people at different times of the day, a wide diversity of users in terms of age, and also a wide diversity of uses. The fascinating thing is that all these spaces have that. And many of the people that use these spaces, although they acknowledge, for example, that the drug dealers were a problem, it was the dealers that were a problem in the minds of the residents, whereas in the eyes of the Parks Department, it was the abstract of the public that was the problem. By the early 2000s, citizens mobilized demanding more green space in the northern part of Paris, and eventually through a combination of sort of electoral politics, they were able to get the support of an emerging Green Party socialist coalition, which in 2011 led to the election of Paris's first socialist party mayor. And they threw the weight behind him, and they were rewarded after his victory by the announcement of a major new park to build over a piece of disused railroad infrastructure in the northern part of Paris. So the northern part of Paris landscape is very different than the Paris you might know. It's a largely post-industrial area with empty factories and a lot of active and disused railroad infrastructure. It's actually the Paris behind the two big northern train stations. It's the area I'm talking about. This is another view of the Squadron. The new project, the new park project, was called the Jardin des Halles, and it was going to be seen as nothing short of a revolution in park design for two reasons. Let me actually skip ahead to this one here. First, at an ecological level, the design essentially critiqued 2 centuries of public garden design as decadent, wasteful, and unsustainable. The Jardin des Halles would recycle a significant portion of its own water. No fertilizers or chemicals would be used in the lawns, meaning that they have these kind of, by classic standards, heretical irregularities, and that irregularity was okay. And in addition, the overall appearance of the space was very sparse, minimal, even austere, and multiple uses and open access lawns were central to the design from the beginning. So it kind of went against a long tradition of French landscape planning design. At a social level, what's to me even more interesting, let me go back here. An entirely new approach was given to managing the Jardin des Halles because of the issues that had happened in the 18th and 19th arrondissements in northern Paris before that. It was stressed from the beginning that the publics of northern Paris were different than other publics and required a different kind of public garden with a different management regime. And indeed, the Jardin des Halles was designed around a principle of self-regulation or co-surveillance. Neighborhood organizations would play an unprecedented role in organizing events in the park, and even the design itself stresses mutual shared co-surveillance as opposed to a kind of top-down Big Brother model. And although the Parks Department still played an important role in actually walking through the space, they were given special kind of coaching on the neighborhood, which was interesting beforehand. And also, just the design of the space means that you're always in a position in the park often where you're watching others, but also very much have a sense of being watched. So it sort of spreads out the responsibilities for surveillance. And you can This is kind of an interesting parallel with Detroit in some respects, because you have this kind of classic neoliberal situation in which responsibility is delegated to neighborhood organizations, and this gives them the ability to, on one hand, define new visions of the city, but on the other hand, they are to an unprecedented level responsible for what happens, as opposed to the public sector, which might have been in previous time. In the 7 years since the Jean Dale opened, however, this self-regulatory approach has had mixed and interesting results. There's a very fragile and carefully negotiated sense of order that holds sway in Jean Dale. It has also been in the news as a site where like drug dealers operate, and this has gotten the park negative press. But whereas other spaces in the what just happened there? Whereas other spaces in that northern part of Paris were often seen as failures outright, this kind of indeterminacy or this negotiated aspect of the park was viewed as central to its identity from the beginning. But the part of the design that I want to dwell on the most is the sustainability-oriented aspect. Let's see if I can, maybe this is just loose support. I can do it, definitely do without pictures, but pictures of parks are always nice. The sustainability-oriented aspects of the design that form a kind of the vision of the park as a form of green infrastructure have also created a new way in which, interestingly enough, delinquency can be defined. And this is something I want to call special attention to, because it seems like in an era where ecological citizenship is increasingly seen as important for urban inhabitants, this could become another way that urban inhabitants can be stigmatized. A key theme, for example, is the signal I think just went out. Sure. But I'll just continue talking right here. One of the fascinating things about the Jean Dale's ecological design was the fact that the architects were very sensitive to the species of trees and plants, even the built environment of the park, in order to attract certain species of birds to the park. People ask why, and one of the reasons was that in this kind of post-industrial neighborhood that was often talked about as a dead area of the city, bringing nature and birds singing to the area was seen as kind of a nice, would give it a kind of pleasing atmosphere. But even more interestingly, birds are very important for the circulation of biomass in urban areas. They spread seeds, they even spread bits of soil. And in this new way of thinking about parks and cities, which is becoming global, of thinking of parks as infrastructure, which, like all infrastructure, involves movements and flows, birds actually play an important role in the movement of biomass through green infrastructure. So that was a very central part of the park's design. However, after it was built, the birds never came. And the fascinating thing was when I talked to the landscape architects and officials from the Paris Parks Departments, the blame for the birds not coming had a lot to do with the public of the park. Oh, great, we're back. Okay. Let me just jump ahead real quick to this couple. Okay. Okay. Sure. How am I doing with time? 2 minutes? Okay, sure. That's definitely all we'll need, probably. This is part of a plan called the Plan de Biodiversité de Paris, which came out in 2011, which is a way to redraw the city's infrastructure, reimagine flows and movements in the cities around the theme of biodiversity. It's becoming increasingly common in the way the cities are being planned and re-envisioned around the world. It's in fact explicitly positioned as part of Paris's, a way for Paris to get a competitive edge in their global cities is through this kind of emphasizing biodiversity. And it is a fact that many cities have more biodiversity within them than the country and rural areas immediately around them. So the city of Paris was really keen to kind of capitalize on this. And what this map is a map of flows of biodiversity. And a lot of these flows are actually old railroad infrastructure, in which the abandoned spaces along the edges of the tracks are sometimes they're abandoned spaces, they're kind of median along live tracks, and sometimes they're abandoned tracks, are seen as important places for the movements of animals, the movement of pollinators, movements of plant species, and of course the Seine and the water is an important part of this. But fascinatingly enough, it was youth using the park, and specifically youth using the park after hours, late at night, which again, by a kind of classic standard of studying the use of urban space, would often be seen as a sign of people's, the fact that people really like the space, that they wouldn't go home, that they always wanted to be there. But it was that usage of people hanging out at night talking, and specifically a certain penchant for motor scooters that a lot of kids have. They provide a cheap mode of transportation around Paris and its suburbs, but they also are an enemy, their single-stroke engines are an enemy of environmentalists because they're dirty emissions outputs. And so it was this quality of scooters and this quality of teenage kids basically hanging in the park that we're seeing as a kind of clog or stoppage to the flows of biomass throughout Paris's green infrastructure. And in many ways, what we're seeing right now, and then this is a project that I'm still in the process of conceptualizing, is a recasting of immigrant rhetoric in France with an ecological kind of flavor to it based on these kinds of issues, which are urban, but also ecological. And I guess the last thing I'd want to say then is to turn back to the question of Paris, or excuse me, Detroit. I'll excavate my last page here. I guess because I'm starting off the talk or the symposium, what I really wanted to do was kind of start with a comparative case, and then that kind of classically allows us to look back on Detroit and ask a couple of questions. I think Paris obviously has a very distinct history with regards to urban nature and the importance of gardens in the city. But if you look at the example of Detroit and the social history of the United States with regards to nature, I think there's also maybe important things to look at comparatively here. Especially if you look at, like, for example, recent politics over green space in Belle Isle and the way that vacancy and natural spaces in the city are talked about in that context as kind of urban prairie. And so there's a lesson to learn that you can talk about both places, pull both places together with. I'd say it's that in many respects, landscape architects and designers plan these spaces and envision them, but it's residents, so-called users, that finish them in many respects. And so I think that that's something that we can kind of hold on to as we kind of think about this city going forward. So thanks a lot.
Okay, in organizing the session, I've been asked to set aside a couple of minutes after each paper for questions for the specific panelists, and then at the end of our symposium, or our panel today, I'll have an opportunity to ask questions to the panel and to have more meta comments about reinventing the city. Are there any comments for Andrew? Dave?
How do you envision, or how do you understand the sort of residential pattern that basically pushes the working class in Paris to the Banlieue, and the outer rim, as opposed to sort of American model where working class is pushed traditionally into the center of the city,
Right.
And the way in which the parks developed in Paris as a response to sort of primarily bourgeois population. I'll stop with that.
Yeah, sure. No, the relationship between where green space is and the spatial organization of inequality in both cities is really interesting. Certainly Paris' center city, and I'm glad I have this map up right here, has always been seen as a kind of royal, was going back to the era, monarchical era, kind of a royal zone, and sometimes to this day it's critiqued by urbanists as a museumized part of the city that's almost not even alive in some respects, it's just monumental. But the outer parts of Paris have largely been very socially heterogeneous, even to this day. And the banlieue of Paris, you can actually see there's a lot of green space in them as well, outside the city, outside the ring. Some of these are large cemeteries, actually, and some of them are urban forests. But I think that what's happened is that the politics of the Socialist Party in France, at least in Paris, have been oriented explicitly on shifting the focus of urbanism from monuments to neighborhoods. And this is true at just the city of Paris level, but also at the regional level. And so there's increasing investment there's increasing investment in green spaces in Paris and post-industrial areas that are also the outskirts of the city and that are also kind of working class areas historically. And so it's precisely because of that investment in these areas that these kinds of conflicts arise, I think. And in Detroit, I guess the situation is really different. But you do have this kind of old civic infrastructure planned and envisioned by elites early on, like Belle Isle, for example, in a city which over the years became increasingly working class and increasingly African American. And in that context, I think that sets up a whole other set of politics over who has the right to the city in terms of parks. But that in some ways mirror issues in France because you have a kind of, often with parks and ecology, you have a technocratic elite planning a vision of a space, which in fact in everyday life might be used by people in a working class neighborhood. So it depends, but If that question is, if that answer is a little vague, but that's kind of how I talk about comparison. Yeah.
Seems like a paradox to keep nice parks, the public is actually the enemy. So the most difficult thing to keep the park and nature nice is actually people.
Yes.
And that's so parks are designed for people, but people are the enemy of the park.
Right.
It's not like a museum.
Yeah.
To look at.
No, that's a great